So often when we talk about the problems with drugs, we assume that in the drug is the problem.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
No matter how many just say no kind of campaigns we run, the reality is we've been trying this now for over a century and it hasn't worked.
Australia, first country in the world to classify psychedelics as a legitimate medicine.
You know, you go to Davos, you will see panels on psychedelics and brain optimization. People like Elon Musk talk about how, you know, whatever I'm doing with ketamine, it should clearly be celebrated because look at the returns that I'm offering to my shareholders.
I mean, it's legal, right?
It's totally legal.
Definitely within the next couple of decades, the norms and standards around these industries will be crystallized, will be hardened, and trying to reverse them at that point will be like what we're trying to do with things like social media and tech, oligopolistic ownership, extractive practices, mass commodification. If we are going to move beyond the war on drugs, how do we move beyond it?
The question used to be, should we legalize drugs? Now, with forms of drug liberalisation in Germany, Barcelona, Thailand, and increasing parts of the United States, the question is more, how should we legalise drugs? The 20th century war on drugs had a decisive victor, and it wasn't prohibition. But the war on drugs wasn't really about drug use at all. It was about enshrining American hegemony, having a tool of social control for working class communities and people of colour at home, and embedding a global system of capitalist extraction and resource hoarding. But drug legalisation might not actually be a silver bullet to all those things. In fact, our next guest, Kojo Koram, argues that drug legalisation can just be a reinvention of those same systems of oppression. That is, if we let it. His new book, The Next Fix, looks at drug liberalisation efforts the world over and examines why everyone from Silicon Valley tech bros to the MAGA movement is looking to get in on the action. We talk about everything from addiction to harm reduction, from indigenous use of plant medicine to why English culture wouldn't be the same without prodigious use of opium. I hope you enjoy the interview. Kojo Koram, welcome to Downstream again.
Thank you for having me back.
I mean, we didn't actually invite you. You just refused to leave.
I never want to leave.
From the first interview. He's been here for years. Your new book, The Next Fix, it's a really... it was provocative in that it suggested something that I've not seen argued elsewhere. Because your previous work regarding the war on drugs has said, look, this has been a way to sort of use drugs as a pretext for shaping a global order, capitalist extraction, resource hoarding, racism, indigenous displacement, all of these things. And then with this book, you're saying, well, you can legalize drugs and also do all those same things. What got you to that place?
I think the journey that brought me to this book really is founded in kind of two moments. And so the initial impetus for my interest in the way that drug policy has been used to facilitate structures of power was
how much cocaine costs these days.
Infuriating, but no. It was working as a young lawyer in the United States of America, and I ended up working at Angola prison, which is in Louisiana, which, for viewers is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. It's a prison that is the size, I think slightly larger, in fact, than the island of Manhattan, if you just want to imagine the scale of it. And people might think, why is a prison in the American Deep South called Angola? Seems like a strange name. Well, the reason is because the prison was formerly a slave plantation, and the slaves who populated it came from Angola in Africa, and it maintains this name up until today. And so that gives you just an example of the type of history and politics that informs this institution. And so I went there in 2012, and the scene that greeted me could have easily have been 1812, I
mean, tell me about convict pinball.
It was, Angola's famous for having not only the largest maximum security prison in the United States, but also for its rodeo. And its rodeo is an opportunity where inmates perform different types of daredevil stunts for the entertainment of the local population. And one of those is convict pinball, where the inmates, will line up in a 10-pin bowling formation, and a, giant Brahman bull will be released, and the last inmate to stay standing on their spot wins the equivalent of $250, which doesn't sound like much to be gored and thrown in the air by a giant bull, but considering you might be paid 2 cents an hour for your prison labor work whilst you're there, that's quite a substantial amount.
And who's in there? Like, who's in Angola?
And so when you walk in Angola, you can see, the very visible racial demographics of the place. I mentioned, I went in 2012, and the scene you're confronted with could easily have been 1812. It's, disproportionately Black and Latino inmates. You will see, 12, 15 Black guys working the fields, one guard on horseback looking over them. You'll see inmates being led around in kind of shackles and manacles. And, I remember going there and thinking, I stumbled onto the set of 12 Years a Slave. I was like, where is Brad Pitt to get me out of here? And you start thinking, when you're in that kind of institution, how does an institution this size reproduce itself? And what I found out speaking to the inmates was that a lot of those inmates are in there not for, armed robbery or murder, but are in there for drugs. Cultivating drugs, even possessing drugs, can lead to multiple convictions in a state like Louisiana, and it's a multiple offender law, what's commonly known as the three strikes law, which means, three multiple offender laws can lead to you having life imprisonment without the chance of parole. And so that was kind of the initial interest in the relationship between drugs and histories and structures of power. And then almost exactly a decade later, I found myself speaking at one of the largest cannabis trade expos in the world, Cannabis Europa, right here in the heart of the city of London. And there, you're confronted with, slick suited biotech founders, commercial life sciences lawyers, people who working for pharmaceutical companies, and, everybody is hyper professional, hyper amiable as well. But I just remember thinking, at the heart of it, these people are doing exactly the same thing that the people I met in Angola are doing, which is facilitating, the cultivation and distribution of what we've come to consider as a drug, cannabis. And so that dichotomy made me think about what happens when you shift drugs in different categories. What happens when something transitions from being contraband, as a lot of substances have been for the 20th century, to becoming a commodity. And we're seeing this process of commodification happen in real time right now, with cannabis, with psychedelics, and considered with a lot of other substances as well. And I think that now's the time to really make an intervention in that, in order to try and shape that market in a way that might not reproduce so many of the same inequalities that we've seen across so many other industries.
Have you ever seen that film Layer Cake?
I remember Layer Cake.
You remember Layer
Daniel
Cake?
Craig, yeah.
And Daniel Craig, in his opening monologue, says, and he's a drug dealer in the film for those who have classier taste in cinema than me and Kojo. He says in his opening monologue, always remember that one day all of this drug monkey business will be legal. They won't leave it to people like me, not when they figure out how much money there is to be made, not millions, fucking billions. And do you think that that's sort of the shift that we're witnessing, which is you had a 20th century defined by prohibition, defined by the war on drugs, defined by rhetoric around a drug-free world, even if everyone knew that that's not really possible. And now there's the sort of expansion of tech money, financialization into this world of drugs. And then the people who were criminalized for participating in an illegal trade in drugs are sort of, they're left to rot in prisons. And now here come the suits.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's no coincidence that we've seen this successful transition of certain substances from being contraband into being commodities in the era in which there's been so much stagnation around the economy, following 2008. That kind of brings a close to a certain cycle of growth and expansion. The reason why the book is called The Next Fix is really not just talking about the role of the idea of a fix in drug terms, but also, for our Marxist bros, a fix in terms of historical materialism, in terms of capitalism's perpetual need to draw in new sources of input in order to commodify, perhaps most famously articulated by David Harvey when he talks about the spatial fix following the kind of stagnation of the economy in the 1960s and 1970s. Capitalism expands into new territories, what we commonly refer to as globalization or neoliberalism, finding new sources of inputs in order to commodify. And that cycle really kind of brings itself to conclusion in 2008. We see that stagnation, we see growth flatlining, we see increasing rentierism and inequality, and we see the desire from both private capital for new sources of profit and for states, states that are really damaged by austerity in order to find new sources of tax revenue. And so in that moment comes this question of legalization of particularly cannabis, first in the USA, which is a conversation that's been happening, since the 1960s, but it really starts to gain traction in the aftermath of 2008, with Colorado and Washington State becoming the very first states to legalize the commercial trade of cannabis in 2012. And so in that moment, you start to see the potential economic growth that is encapsulated within these particular drugs. And so looking at what impact that has had on economies in the decades since legalization really began, Deloitte, the accountancy firm, ran an analysis of the contribution of cannabis to the Canadian economy following its legalization. And they found that within the first decade, it added $76 billion to the Canadian economy. And so we are talking about a potentially very lucrative new emerging industry in cannabis, in psychedelics, and in potentially other drugs over the coming few decades. And so the question is, who is that industry going to work for? Where are those profits going to be spent? Where are they going to be hoarded? And can it be different to what we've seen in tech, where we've essentially resulted in monopolization, the kind of entrenchment of wealth, hyper concentration of wealth, and a society where I think many people would wish that we'd intervened in the way that we regulated the internet at its point of origin, in order perhaps not to have those oligopolistic standards that we now live with in the 21st century.
I'm going to speak for perhaps a section of our viewers who are going to be watching this and going, well, look, this is all well and good, but drugs are obviously harmful. They're addictive and they kill people. So, we can be talking about weed, that's fine, but something like crack cocaine, something like heroin, something like fentanyl, is the proposition here that people just have unmitigated access to feed an addiction which may well kill them?
Yeah. Well, I think that this is something where we perhaps haven't done a substantial enough job of explaining that legalization doesn't mean commercialization and doesn't mean kind of retail distribution. At the start of this year, the Green Party got themselves into a lot of trouble because Labour had an attack line on their policy of legalizing and regulating all drugs. And I think that that's because Labour managed to play on the gap in people's understanding between legalization and the idea that that means you can then go and buy it from Tesco. Next to your crunchy nut cornflakes, you're going to be buying crack cocaine and heroin. And that is
our day will come.
That is not the policy of the Green Party or any of the different jurisdictions around the world that have implemented different forms of legalization. And so with drugs that clearly are, very risky behavioral practices and can have a very damaging impact upon their consumers, I don't think there's any proposal where the idea is legalization means you can buy it in the shop. Perhaps the most ambitious of the legalization bills that have been put through national parliaments over the past decade has been the Colombian bill to legalize the coca plant and all different derivatives from the coca plant that was put forward by Senator Ivan Marulanda, who's actually, used to work with Luis Galan, who was killed by Pablo Escobar, and so had been at the very heart of the impact of the war on drugs, pushing this idea that, we need to clamp down on the war on drugs, and then comes back a couple of decades later and goes, actually, this isn't working. This is just leading to more violence. What we need to do is to look at legal regulation. In the bill that Marulanda and his team drafted and put forward, they had a very tiered structure for how the coca leaf could be legalized. And so, the kind of soft caffeine-esque coca leaf tea, they might find that being open for commercial distribution. For, drugs like cocaine, which people will understand, the impacts that can have on its users. They were looking at a much more prescription kind of health-based model. And then with drugs with a real acute potential of harm, things like crack cocaine, they'd be looking for something similar to the kind of prescription treatment that we see with heroin use in places like Switzerland. And so I don't think many people would consider Switzerland to be a kind of radical, liberal, freewheeling society, but they've had heroin prescription treatment for decades now, where if people do have addiction dependencies, a certain compulsive use, which is clearly damaging their life, you're able to access use of that particular drug through the state, combined with supportive treatment, mental health care intervention, housing intervention, support around your employment status, and all these different attempts to try and help you transition into a much more healthier stage of your life. I understand that there's a kind of impulsive response towards the damage that we see drugs doing in people's life, and anyone who's had people they care about who've suffered with addiction, I can understand that impulse is to try and say this is bad, and because it's bad, we're going to prohibit it and criminalize it, and hopefully that will banish it out of existence. The reality is we've been trying this now for over a century, and it hasn't worked. The drug-free world that the UN promised in 1998 isn't manifesting. In fact, we're seeing drug use go up, drug addiction go up, death from drug use go up, and particularly here in the UK, where death from drug use has been going up year on year now for the past few years, and we have one of the highest drug death rates in all of Europe. He
says we don't make things in this country
exactly.
anymore.
He says, Britain first, Britain number one. We don't tend to flag that up as much as we should maybe. But I think it's part of the kind of ignorance around this conversation, though the stigma and the paranoia around drugs is allowed to fester. There is a lot of work that I've done, before academia, working in treatment centers and supporting people with drug dependencies. And I don't think I ever met anybody with a dependency who said, having a criminal record has been really helpful in allowing me to transition, off my substance use issues. Criminal record isn't just putting somebody in prison, it's putting a mark upon their name, which means they're going to struggle to access employment. They're going to struggle to be able to get visas to be able to travel abroad. They're going to have all of these compounding issues over the next few chapters of their life, which is going to lead to them being increasingly excluded and increasingly isolated from society. And that's exactly the right position that leads to dependency issues continuing to percolate.
There's also, though, cultural considerations, by which I mean, I'm not certain that we can trust the society that we've got not to commercialize something to an extent that it becomes really, really harmful. And I'll give you an example. I was recently in Thailand, and obviously beautiful country, beautiful culture. I last went there 8 years ago, so, it's been a fair amount of time. When I went 8 years ago, obviously drugs were available, but there was a sort of understanding, right? That you could market something as a hippie shake, that would be fine, but there would be some kind of policing. Since then, cannabis has been legalized in a sort of, experiment. And everywhere I went in Thailand were these awful, gaudy, garish weed shops, which were open really, really late at night, and
neon lights, luminous,
and the way in which that combined with a tourism economy, and the sort of attitude of tourists, which is like, I come here, I have my good time, I take. There's not a lot of respect for the culture or respect for Thai people. That had gotten even worse with the legalization of weed. Even in Toronto, when I went and I walked past the weed shops, I was like, these things are ugly. They are ugly. They're disgusting. I'd never want to see that shade of purple ever again in my entire life. And this might sound shallow, but I do think that it's the kind of thing people think about, which is, sure, we might not think that cannabis is the most harmful drug in the world. We might not think it's the one which is the most risky in terms of, its behaviors. But where we've seen it legalized and it's taken this very commercial form, it's not been an addition to the culture where you go, that's great. It's like if you saw McDonald's everywhere, you wouldn't have been like, what a victory for fine cuisine.
I think that this is why it's really important to try and intervene in this conversation now, because I think that, like I mentioned previously, that there's been a kind of recognition that the war on drugs has reached its point of expiration. Nobody, I don't think, significantly thinks that we're going to create a drug-free world, no matter how much we criminalize, no matter how many people we arrest, no matter how many just say no kind of campaigns we run. Nobody assumes that we're reaching a world where the use of these drugs is going to disappear. And so there is a conversation now about what comes afterwards. And there is a question, for me, it's a quotation that comes to mind is one by Clement Attlee, who I don't think would appreciate being brought into a conversation around drugs.
I don't think he's the waviest prime minister we've ever had.
Probably the least wavy. But Attlee talked about repurposing the British state following the conclusion of the Second World War, and had the quote that, if the state could be used for war and death, then it could also be used for peace and the sustaining of life. And so there is, questions around what legalization looks like that are actually very boring technical questions. In a lot of ways, I thought that this book, which kind of goes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that has implemented some form of drug policy reform or legalization and tries to find out what it's done and what's been the impacts on people, it's kind of like the world's most boring drugs tour in the world, because I was just going to all these different countries and being like, what's your kind of licensing regime? What kind of, do you have vertical integration structure here? And these questions around, is legalization going to lead to the kind of mass advertising, mass commercialization, the financialized version of it that we've seen in the United States, where, you will see, adverts for cannabis companies, in the high street. You will be able to, we can go off iPhones now and, log into a trading app and start investing in a cannabis, exchange traded fund. You will see this spectacularization of this new emerging industry, because those are the mechanisms through which capitalism manages to increase and grow its particular use. But particularly when we talk about these substances that have had a century of stigmatization, and people do have a kind of cultural nervousness around it, I think that maybe that provides an opportunity to say, okay, well, can we create a new type of industry, one that doesn't encourage the kind of relentless consumption that every other industry, from fashion to fast food, encourages under capitalism. And I think an interesting example of this is the kind of first major country to legalize cannabis in Europe, which was Germany. And so Germany, through its traffic light coalition, introduced the legalization of cannabis. It announced it around 2021. And in the cannabis and the pharmaceutical industry, this was seen as, the next golden moment of the green rush. All of these biotech companies, are flying into Frankfurt, just can't wait to start carving up that Berlin cannabis. They're thinking this is going to be a huge explosion market, Europe's biggest economy, huge, cultural affinity to kind of hedonistic culture in places like Berlin and Hamburg. We're going to have, massive cannabis dispensaries on every high street across Germany. But instead of allowing the kind of commercial trade of cannabis, and also partly because of some of the restrictions of the EU, but the German government, when they finally legalized cannabis, legalized a form of, first of all, home growth. So individuals are now allowed to grow their own use, but also cannabis social clubs, which of course they were learning from the example that's been the norm in Barcelona and Catalonia for the past couple of decades, where, this is a more cooperative model of producing and consuming products, let's say, for people who might not be familiar, closer to like the local community veg garden than to like an Apple store as you have in the USA. And so people can be members of these cannabis social clubs, can learn about the plant, can learn about cultivating, but don't have the kind of customer consumer relationship that you have in the United States. And of course, that comes with restrictions on things like advertising, restrictions on things like, the ways in which you can try and expand markets traditionally in capitalism. And so I think that all these questions are open questions about how is this going to be produced, what's going to happen to traditional producers in places like Jamaica and Morocco. Can we, try and move away from the more extractive norms that have been established in other industries like coffee and, the production of cocoa and stuff like that. Intervening at this particular moment, I think, is crucial because within the next decade, or definitely within the next couple of decades, the norms and standards around these industries will be crystallized, will be hardened, and trying to reverse them at that point will be like what we're trying to do with things like social media and tech.
I suppose to ask a version of this question, which is framed in a more personal way. Did becoming a parent at all change how you thought about drugs? And have you considered, how am I going to raise my kid in a world in which drugs exist? Because the fear of parents is something which is often played on when it comes to talking about things like, drug liberalisation. Well, I'm worried about my kid. Well, I don't want this near a school. Well, remember Leah Betts, stuff of that nature. So, how do you as a parent think about what you want your kid to know about drugs?
I mean, well, this is, I think, such a important and personal question, like you say, because the fears around parenthood have been the real engine for prohibition. We see that, every time. You saw that with the Green Party's campaign in Gorton and Denton, where, the Labour Party's response was, they're going to have crack cocaine in the playgrounds and in schools. And, Keir Starmer was in Parliament saying, I have a 17-year-old son, and these people want him to be able to, access drugs. Part of me did think, if you look at the history of politicians in Westminster, the relationship between drugs and the industry in which Starmer works in is perhaps potentially closer than anything the Green Party could cultivate. But the question of trying to ensure that kids are safe is one that I think anyone who's a parent can understand. There's an instinctive desire to try and protect your child. But I think it's important always with drugs to look at, what is the evidence? What is the evidence for actually what makes things less risky? And, the stigma and paranoia about drugs has been so strong that the idea of harm reduction, the very idea of harm reduction is a controversial policy when it comes to drugs. The idea of reducing harm of a risky substance. I think that, is there any other risky behavior that humans engage with that we would say harm reduction is something that is negative? I'm not a perfect or enlightened person. I have my own prejudices in this world, Motorbike riding, I might be like, that is crazy, You
are not getting on that motorbike.
There's a lot of, Novara viewers. I apologize to you if you have your motorbikes, but every time I do see a motorbike ride past me, I think, is that really what God put you on this earth for? To be whisking in and out of lorries at 80 miles an hour in a motorbike? But that's my own fears and prejudices.
So when your kid turns 21, the baby reins are still on him.
But let me bring it back round so I don't seem like, just someone who's aggressive, bigot against motorcycle riders.
I don't want them to know this about me.
If someone like myself with my instinctive fears around something like motorbike riding was to gain political office and to say, well, because I consider this to be an inherently risky activity, what I think we should do is we should make this as risky and dangerous as possible so that there is maximum harm in order to deter people from ever trying to engage in this activity. So no helmets, no airbags within the motor. I want as maximum damage as possible. People would look at me like I
No
had four
brakes.
heads. Exactly. They'd be like, that is an insane policy proposal.
But the parallel would be with sex, right? So
Absolutely.
the parallel would be with abstinence-only sex education, which
Absolutely.
has sort of died a death in the UK, and rightly so. But it was a bit more of a live discussion
Absolutely.
when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And it's still obviously a very live discussion in the United States, which is the idea of if you don't teach children about safe sex, they're not going to have sex.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like we've seen the impacts of having a much more nuanced understanding around sex education, including not just things like safe sex, but also things like consent, and seeing the impact that has had upon society, opening up different forms of sexuality as well for kids to learn about. And I think it's interesting that, there hasn't been that same development with education around drugs and substances. I also got the Leah bets. That was our drug education. If you ever look at a drug, you will die. That is what is going to happen.
For younger viewers who may never have heard Leah Betts, what was the Leah Betts story?
So Leah Betts was a young person who took ecstasy, and also, I think there's some dispute around what was the actual cause of her death. She was drinking a lot of water as well, but ultimately ended up passing away. And what was most significant about that was Leah Betts' parents actually took a picture of her on her in a hospital, and that was then, weaponized as drug education across the country. So people would go to schools, put that on the big projector, show a picture of this poor person, on the edge of death, tubes and everything, or plugged into a body, and tell kids, if you ever look at a drug, this is what will happen. And so that functioned as drug education. And the problem with that is that led to if you kind of hype up and spectacularize the harms of drugs to such an extent that when there is any encounter of children with drugs, or they know anybody has an encounter with children with drugs, and that isn't the consequence, then they might assume that these are completely risk-free activities. And that's also not the message we want kids to kind of take on. And so we want to have a much more sober, much more evidence-based education of drugs. And I also think we need to try and implement harm reductionist policies. Like I mentioned, if you talked about, whether it's, motorcycle rider being as dangerous as possible, boxing being like, this is dangerous, so we're just going to have bare knuckle boxing, unregulated boxing, skiing, whatever risky behavior humans want to engage in. The idea of trying to mitigate the potential harms of it is seen as something that's logical and something that is consistent with trying to cultivate a good society. But yet with drugs, even things like needle exchange programs where people can access clean needles, even things like, overdose prevention centers, in which was I
was going to say, tell me about Peter Krykant. Is that his name?
That's correct, yeah. So Peter Krykant was a addiction support worker and a person who had a long time relationship with substances himself, who in the midst of the pandemic recognized that with the closure of all of these treatment centers and with the imposition of, social distancing and lockdown and all the masking requirements, Scotland, which already has by far and away the highest drug death rate in Europe, the UK has the
Is that because
Scotland,
of opioids?
Particularly with opioids. And there's, a lot of complex factors that kind of feed into that. There is the, the alienation, from the 1980s of deindustrialization, everything that is depicted in, Trainspotting, seen as something that is driving the huge death rate of drug users in Scotland, many of whom are described as the Trainspotting generation, who are now, suffering the consequences of a lifetime of use. And Peter Krykant recognized that with the closure of these support centers, there was going to be an explosion of drug deaths, even higher than the rate that Scotland is currently dealing with. And so through his own initiative and a great personal risk, he got a minivan, he loaded it up with some clean needles, some naloxone, which is, been widely mainstreamed as a treatment in the United States and in North America as an opioid overdose reversal drug. It's able to bring people, from the point of death, almost Lazarus-like, back to point of recovery. And he went around the streets of Glasgow, letting people know that this was now an overdose prevention center. And if people had already acquired drugs, they'd already used drugs, they could use them in the van. He would oversee the injection and he would reverse the overdoses, which he did for a number of people. He would ensure they had access to clean needles, and he would try to provide this treatment service, which has been used in countries. It started off again in Switzerland, so not the most radical of countries. Started off in
I think they're wrong in that. You can't. A country that invents Toblerone can't be right. Can't be right.
But it's fascinating that, so often I think conservative voices would associate drug policy reform with, radical leftist experiments. But, in countries like Switzerland, even Canada, Uruguay, a lot of these places, this isn't particularly tied in with any kind of great radicalism. It's seen as evidence following the evidence, following the attempt to try and intervene in these issues in a way that minimizes harm and puts on the forefront public health. And so you go to Berlin, you go to Barcelona, you go to Bern in Switzerland, you'll find overdose prevention centers, and you will see that they have had, if anyone looks at the evidence, reducing drug deaths from that, reducing infections, all of the kind of negative social consequences that can come with drug use can come down. And so without any of those examples in the UK, Peter started his very first one, this mobile overdose prevention center in his van. He was arrested for it.
What was the legal status of it?
And so this is what he decided to push. The Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971 prohibits the possession of drugs. It prohibits the supply of drugs. But Peter was arguing, well, I'm doing neither. I'm just providing a space for people who already have drugs and who are going to use them anyway to use it in a safe and protected environment. And his argument was that this could be established under the current legal regime in the United Kingdom. So he was arrested at one point the police tried to search his van. He didn't want them to search the van because there was somebody using the van. And, he was arrested for obstructing that search. That was just an opportunity for him to kind of amplify the campaign even further. And the ultimate result in that is just a couple of years ago, Scotland actually established the first legal, formal overdose prevention centre in Glasgow, known as the Thistle. And, a lot of credit, I think, for the establishment of that has to go to Peter Crican's activism over the course of the pandemic. And that's something that now a lot of other cities across the UK that have really entrenched, substance use issues are looking at implementing as well.
I mean, I want to ask you a little bit about, I suppose, like democratic consent for things like that, because I think there are lots of people who, in the abstract, would say, yeah, this is quite a common sense measure, but I don't want it near my house. I don't want it near my place of work. And I see a bit of a parallel with the dispersal policy around asylum seekers, which is asylum seekers as a result of new Labour policy got put in some of the poorest and most deprived parts of the UK, seemingly designed to create division and a breakdown of support for taking in asylum seekers. So how can you square that circle? Like, what's in it for any local community to say we're going to have a safe use centre?
Yeah, I think the importance of trying to make these arguments, because when you're talking about things like overdose prevention centres, you are talking about entrenched, fear as well and hostility considering the idea of drug use. I think there's an important element of, first of all, making it clear that a lot of the fears of, the idea of increased crime, unsafe injecting equipment being left around. A lot of these issues are things that are encouraged and actually accelerated by Prohibition itself. You can go across the back alleys in Glasgow or Liverpool or Bristol and you can see the all of these fears that are often ramped up by prohibitionists still occurring under the system of prohibition. You can see the increased drug death rates around, people using substances in the era of prohibition. There's never been a recognized death in any overdose prevention center anywhere across the world. And you can see young people dying from these substances under prohibition. I think the kind of counter to the parent voice that you mentioned a little bit earlier could be an organization that's called Anyone's Child, which is a group of parents who have all lost their kids through drug use over the past few decades. And instead of advocating for increased crackdown, increased criminalization, they make the connection between the way that prohibition increases the risks of drug use, makes drug use less safe, makes people who use drugs less able to access medical treatment, and that kind of line of continuum leading to the tragedy that these poor parents have had to live through. And so I think making it clear to people the impact that prohibition has on society, I think, is a way to try and square that circle between these reforms and the way that people will instinctively feel nervous about them. And I think that this has been a kind of key element of the ability for legalization, particularly around cannabis, to happen in the United States of America, where the way that cannabis legalization has happened across the states has actually been through popular referendum, through ballot initiatives. And so if you get enough signatories on a particular petition, you can have a single issue voted for within the state legislature at each election cycle. And that is what happened in Colorado and Washington. And that's been copied across all the different now, I think 25 states in the US that have now legalized cannabis. And so this has happened through popular support, and the way the popular support has been cultivated isn't by saying that legalization is a silver bullet and it's going to solve all of the social problems, isn't by minimizing some of the potential, consequences that might come with legalization that need to be managed, but is by making it clear the damage that prohibition has done to society, to individual lives, and to all of the fears around drugs that a lot of people carry. If we're concerned about drugs being dangerous and drug use increasing, well, that's what we're seeing right now.
One of, for me, the most interesting personal stories that's in the book is a guy called Stephen, who talks very candidly about his experiences with addiction, the breakdown of his relationship, and that his former partner and mother of his child actually did something really unusual, which is why she said, I can't be in a relationship with you while you're in active addiction. She did her best to facilitate a relationship between him and his child. And it reminded me actually of, that like Frank Ocean song, which is like your family stopped inviting you to things, won't let you hold their infants.
Yeah.
Moving away from, I guess, the legal aspects of prohibition, but thinking about the way in which people with problematic drug use are sort of framed, and the way socially, they're understood. Do you think that culturally there is too much stigma attached to people with active drug addictions in such a way that makes problems worse because they're sort of being cut off from potential networks of support?
Yeah, well, I think that this is something that's been a real conversation within kind of addiction studies and people who work in treatment centers. And I think it's striking that even the idea of the word drug addiction has now become so controversial. I used it in the book because that's what a lot of the people I spoke to, like Peter, like Stephen, who'd had active substance use issues, that was the word that they used. And so allowing their voices to speak is what I wanted to kind of bring forward. But, the DSM no longer uses the idea of drug addiction. It refers to substance use disorders because it feels that addiction individualizes the issue and kind of reduces it to a more biological issue rather than the broader social context, which actually produces a lot of these substance dependency issues that we see. And I think that there has been so much development and evolution around the support of people with different other forms of mental health issues. We have a much more fluent culture and conversation around things like trauma and depression, anxiety, PTSD. But I think drug addiction continues to carry this historical stigma, which means that a lot of the treatment provisions and a lot of the legislative responses, because I think it is still tied to the law, if you wanted to create the idealized condition for somebody to continue to be trapped within active addiction, it would be isolating them. It would be cutting them off from their community. It would be cutting them off from economic opportunity. And that is what the legal structure of criminalization does. And so I think when we need to understand, well, why has that emerged? I think we need to go right back to the very origins of the drug war, because whilst we might assume the prohibition is the norm, and these experiments in legalization, these experiments in drug policy reform that we're seeing in Canada, in Germany, in the USA seem like this crazy new world, the reality is these drugs have been used by human society since time immemorial. You go back 5,000 years, the Yellow River, you'll find Chinese communities using cannabis. You've got cannabis etched into the pyramids talking about the medicinal powers of cannabis. And so these
the hieroglyphs being like, but I've gotten hungry now.
Exactly. We go to, the use of peyote in Mexico, or ayahuasca in Amerindian communities in the Andes. These substances have been used by human societies from time immemorial. And so what is it about the 20th century that led to this this kind of much more compulsive, consumptive relationship with these substances? For me, I would tie that first of all with industrialization, with the mass production of these substances. And then once you start to get the mass production and this compulsive consumption of these substances, you then get this architecture of prohibition that emerges, in the early decades of the 20th century. And so much of that is this spectacular language that demonizes drug users, drug using communities. And, we kind of mock the kind of reefer madness rhetoric in the 21st century. But it's fascinating. As part of this book, I went back in the archives, and a lot of it is helpfully digitized. So a lot of our viewers could do that themselves. Go to the New York Times and read its articles around the early decades of the 20th century where prohibition is emerging. And you'll find headlines like, Negro cocaine fiends are the new Southern menace, which talks about how, cocaine being used.
That would be such a great album name.
Really? Kendrick should get on it if he gets the chance.
That's a Pusher album.
That probably is a Pusher T album. You'll find these stories about, drug-crazed Mexican families, murdering everybody within the city. And that stigmatization of these kind of idea of dehumanizing drug users and drug-using communities, a lot of rhetoric that synthesizes with racial paranoia around zombification and vampire. You can read a lot of the kind of historical work on this area by people like David Cothray, people like Dave Bewley-Taylor, that really expands this fantastically. And I think a lot of that stigmatization still persists even into the 21st century, which means that the policies that we pass aren't evidence-based, but are based on this kind of instinctive or feels like instinctive fear.
I want to talk a bit more about the chapter which was the fix for trauma, which was just such a fascinating chapter, because it made me think a lot about forms of problematic drug use that I've seen, which you wouldn't call addiction. It's not people who are, injecting in the back of an alley or something. But particularly growing up in London, seeing young working class men of colour who are smoking weed every single day.
Yeah.
And the things that were going on in their lives were a sort of heightened exposure to violence, the idea that violence could sort of explode at any time around them, because even if they weren't involved in any gang activity, by virtue of being black and young and living in a certain area, it was assumed that you were, both by police and both by people who were like involved in gang violence themselves. So you were getting it from both sides, dealing with dysfunction within their families, the impacts of mental health issues within their families, and the socially acceptable way to deal with that pain was to smoke weed every day. And there was something there about what wasn't permissible and what wasn't accessible. Wasn't really permissible to talk about yourself as feeling vulnerable, wasn't sort of like culturally accepted to talk about things like depression and anxiety and PTSD, wasn't available for you to seek help for any of these things. But what was okay and what was masculine and what was, seen as part and parcel of being a young man was smoking weed every day. And so I'm someone who is very much in favour of the liberalisation of drug policy. I think that the harms of prohibition have been absolutely catastrophic. But there are also ways in which drugs cause harm and also sort of protect ongoing harm, and create a buffer or an insulator. That means that, well, we don't have to really deal with this group of people because they're smoking weed every day. It's manageable. It's fine.
And I think that speaks to the way in which so often when we talk about the problems with drugs, we assume that, in the drug is the problem. But often we're talking about drugs as a kind of vector for a social problem. And the questions around the impact that drugs have within different societies often depends as much on the society as it does on the drug. The use of particular forms of psychedelics is going to be different when it's released into 21st century hyper-capitalist, late-stage capitalist America than it is when it's used by, agrarian societies in the Andes. These are different societies and facilitate different types of relationships. And so the questions around what role do drugs play with trauma, I think, is such an interesting one to confront, right now in 2026. Just a few months ago, we had, Donald Trump flanked by Joe Rogan and RF Kennedy, signing an executive order that is accelerating psychedelic treatment for trauma issues within the United States of America. And, this was, if you'd have told a Republican in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan used to sit in that very same Oval Office, giving those direct-to-camera, public service messages about drugs are the number one threat in the United States of America, just a couple of generations later, you would have a Republican president sitting in the Oval Office, joking about, can I use some psychedelics, as Trump did? They would have been completely gobsmacked. But that is an example of the way in which we're having this massive transition around psychedelics. Australia was the very first nation state to allow legal psychedelic treatment for PTSD and for treatment-resistant depression in 2023. We're seeing different states in the US, places like Colorado, also open up psychedelic treatment services. And we are seeing now the federal government fast-tracking this particular form of treatment. But when I was in Australia, exploring, how does this relationship between drug legalization and this question of trauma function, I remember being struck speaking to people from kind of indigenous communities who thought that the way in which the new form of drug legalization was being advanced in the country was completely antithetical to their histories of actually using these in order to confront deep-seated traumas. And so, not just the prohibitively expensive cost of the treatment of psychedelic treatment.
It's like 10 grand or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and 20,000 Australian dollars. In order to be able to access, psilocybin and MDMA.
Don't worry, I know a guy. He'll hook you up for cheap.
There's an undercutting of the market, potentially. But, people want to access these legitimate institutions, where you're going to have trained psychotherapists. And I think it is a progress if people, have had really acute mental health issues, suicidal ideation, really acute PTSD. When Trump signed the executive order, he was flanked by US military veterans who were, talking about the miraculous use that ibogaine had on their ability to overcome, suicidal ideation and trauma within their own lives.
So there's something there, right? Which is that these drugs can become a lubrication for a machine of violence and oppression and dehumanization. So it's like, okay, if you want to deal with veterans' trauma. Obviously, there need to be services available, but maybe stop putting them through the fucking war machine.
Think about the society, think about the framework that actually produces that trauma in the first place, and using that moment of reform. So this is what people said to me in Australia, where they also talked about what is the form of treatment that you're trying to kind of advance through legalization. And the phrase that was shared with me was the idea that you can't heal alone. And what we try to do with this very kind of the Western tradition of psychiatric treatment, synthesizing it with these new understandings of how psilocybin and things like MDMA, or not even new understandings of how they can engage in trauma repair. This was something that was quite commonly discussed in mainstream scientific journals prior to the demonization of psychedelics that emerged in the 1960s with the hippie movement and their associations with the anti-war Vietnam movement. There was this idea of them being used to deal with these really entrenched mental health issues that was suppressed for a few decades, and now it seems to be re-emerging. But is it going to simply have psychedelics become the latest biotech wonder drug, the Ozempic of the 2030s? Or is it going to use this opportunity to maybe look at the different traditions that have used these substances and think about not just what are they using, but how are they using it, and what type of society are they trying to normalize, the more communal-based, more communally produced as well, and also communally owned. And I think that's the big unspoken issue when we talk about the way in which psychedelics are being advanced as the new wonder drug for a world that is really in the midst of an unprecedented mental health crisis. The WHO says, we've now got 1 billion people living with a recognized mental health issue. And so
maybe more smartphone will make it better.
I mean, if we have a simply new mental health wonder drug released into that market that is wholly owned and monopolized by a small number of companies, I mean, we can all see how that is going to be another vehicle for the expansion of inequality and isolation that is feeding the very trauma that is creating some of these issues that need to be addressed.
I want to talk about the tech bros for a second, because one of the sort of cultural shifts that you track is the way in which tech bros like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel talk about drug use and the vogue for microdosing that exists in Silicon Valley. And I was thinking about this in terms of the way in which Silicon Valley tech bros have this almost religious pursuit of being an optimized man. So, there's the Brian Johnson stuff, I want to live forever. He just looks like Michael Jackson post the Bad album. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was going to be like,
don't live like that.
Michael did it first. But this sort of like religious pursuit of optimization and the way in which Musk talks about, ketamine use. Well, this isn't for me to get, wasted. This is so that I can be, my best business self. And it made me think, I don't know if you've read a book called Blitzed.
Of course, yeah. By in terms of the use of
crystal
speed,
during World War II.
by the Third Reich,
So basically, he's
the Blitzkrieg.
A historian whose argument is that amphetamines were really central to the Wehrmacht's success in France. Like, how do you get them just steamrolling through, the Ardennes forest? It's because they're not sleeping. Why aren't they sleeping? Because they are absolutely fucking hooned.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, this isn't fully a question, but I guess I was interested in your thoughts on the way in which drugs and this idea of optimization can be integrated into a contemporary project of fascism.
I think that it's such a insightful question, because I think so often the idea about why certain drugs were prohibited was because that they didn't fit in within the traditional mechanisms of capitalist production. And so, Europeans encounter a lot of these substances that are prohibited and commercialize these substances prohibited at the same time that we encounter substances like coffee, like sugar, which have been wholly integrated into the European diet. But, a kind of a crude articulation of the way that some historians would describe the kind of dichotomy that emerges in the early 20th century is that, drugs like cannabis and psychedelics make it hard for you to turn up at the factory every day and, operate the machine. And
too busy watching my hand move.
Exactly. And so that is something that we're starting to see change with the way in which particularly psychedelics are being discussed in this era of, like you say, kind of perpetual self-development and self-optimization. You go to Davos, you will see panels on psychedelics and brain optimization for the 21st century. You will see people like, Elon Musk talk about how, whatever I'm doing with ketamine, it should clearly be celebrated because look at the returns that I'm offering to my shareholders.
The fad for like nootropics as well.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I might counter it in terms of saying, you might have outstanding returns for your shareholders, but you're also, doing the Heil Hitler salute at the presidential inauguration, which, people might say is not the best advert for ketamine use.
And racism, the breakfast of champions.
I mean, I think that I was surprised that the prohibitionists haven't used that as one of the great campaign tools. Like, if you take this, you'll find yourself standing on stage, celebrating the Third Reich.
David Bowie did it first in his Thin White Duke era. I'm saying that there's a pattern.
And what we're often seeing now is the idea that potentially almost different drugs have different impacts for different people. As we move into this world in which inequality is so much more entrenched, and there is this idea of this kind of siloed city on the hill that is insulated from the kind of mass of surplus populations, there is an idea, I think, emerging that certain drugs allow for the kind of enlightened individuals, those who are at the cutting edge of capitalist production, to have a much more expanded, much more optimized brain function, and those should be facilitated and allowed at $20,000, psychedelic treatment services. But for the mass of populations, we still need the same types of criminalization, same types of penalization, and same types of warehousing of surplus populations that the war on drugs has facilitated over the course of the 20th century. Because the other story that is kind of also kind of explored in the book is that as we've had all these waves of legalization, as we've had, articles in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg about the miraculous powers of microdosing, for tech workers, for, finance workers, we've also had a lot of those same institutions. Donald Trump is on one hand signing executive orders, rescheduling cannabis, opening up the industry to tax benefits, signing executive orders, in terms of fast-tracking psychedelic treatment, but he's also blowing up shipping vessels in the Caribbean through accusations of them being narco traffickers. He's also snatching up anybody with a Hispanic last name and having them, sent to black sites in El Salvador under the description of them being drug dealers. And so we can have commercialization and criminalization at the same time.
Well, you've got the abduction of Nicolas Maduro.
Absolutely.
And at the same time issuing a pardon to the former president of Honduras who had been convicted of cocaine trafficking.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm really interested in this part of it because I know that this is the through line in terms of your work is thinking about American empire and the war on drugs. Is how does American empire adapt to this stage in the history of drugs where there is, a degree of legalization? How does, the military-industrial complex and the aims of American hegemony adapt in this sort of era?
I think that really speaks to the potential future of drugs that might be the most dystopian of all of the opportunities that are available, where we are trying to talk about, are we going to be in a world which drugs are criminalized? Are we going to be in a world where drugs are commodified? We might be in a world where they're both simultaneously. And in fact, the criminalization, the crackdown on, the black market, on traditional communities that are associated with the production and cultivation of these substances could actually serve the commodification. If you own a pattern, and this is something that particularly with psychedelics we're seeing really advanced, the way in which pattern hoarding, which has been over the course of neoliberalization, one of the main mechanisms for rentier extraction, having a pattern gives you this exclusive monopoly over the use of this drug as it gets rolled out. If you have that pattern over psychedelics, you have a vested interest in policing people who might have, generic or even naturally produced versions of that same substance. And so can we imagine a future in which, yet it is both legal and expensive to be able to access psilocybin, through these, psychedelic treatment services. But if you pick up a mushroom off the street and are found with it, you can still be facing the full wrath of the American prison industrial complex. And also when we think about, producers in the global south as well, what's their role in this new economy going to be? Is there going to be a extractive process with these producers in places like Morocco, Jamaica, traditional cannabis cultivating communities? Are they going to be allowed access to, European cannabis clinics with EU GMP standards and all of the different restrictions and vehicles that they might have to overcome? These are the questions that I think are still open at the moment. And I think that there's a real danger of, because of the stigma that's been associated with this particular topic with drugs, and also because I think the topic of drugs is often seen as more of a cultural topic, as something that is, a concern of more hedonistic, more hippie version of the left, that the left ignores this conversation, and we find ourselves in 10, 15, 20 years' time with these new emerging industries that have all of these rules which facilitate oligopolistic ownership, extractive practices, mass commodification. And at that point, we are like, oh, can we actually change the licensing laws? Can we change, where the tax revenue gets spent? But at that point, it's often too late. And so I think making that intervention now and trying to think about, well, if we are going to move beyond the war on drugs, how do we move beyond it? More than just if we do or don't. What are the questions around who gets licenses? What are the questions around what advertising is allowed? What are the questions around what forms of distribution and consumption are facilitated? These are the decisions that we need to make now. And I think that those are going to have consequences far in the future. And not only for whatever industry emerges around things like cannabis and psychedelics. We are talking about trying to have different forms of ownership and different forms of regulatory control in everything from social media to, fossil fuel companies, to fashion companies. And if we can kind of experiment or design different forms of production in things like an emerging cannabis industry, implementing initiatives like seed banks for cultivators in the global south that they can access, implementing initiatives like open access patent opportunities where the companies aren't allowed to hoard patents in the way that we've seen in so many of the other pharmaceutical industries, then we potentially provide an example that could be implemented in industries from the production of cocoa to, the production of other crucial medicines all around the world.
I want to come back to something that you talked about, which is that there is this really long history of drug use, and that there's the arguments made by Michael Pollan that if you want to think about human civilization, you have to think about how we developed in tandem with psychoactive substances, whether that's coffee or tobacco or sugar, all these things. And there's definitely a sort of socially acceptable way in which you can talk about like indigenous ways of knowing and blah, 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 blah. Whereas if you apply that to, some of the indigenous ways of knowing in this country, you'd have to say, cocaine on a football away day and a flare up the arse. I suppose...
Deep culture.
Deep culture. A question for me is about the particular role of cocaine in the UK, which is on the one hand, yes, and a very, very expensive preserve of the rich. So it's sort of become low status, right? And psychedelics have become the high status one. But it's also so integrated into things like football culture that when we were close to winning the Euros, you had that fella who was clinging onto a lamppost, doing his bump, and then he stuck a flare up the arse. Why is it that cocaine specifically has played that role in the UK and not other drugs? Like, why is it it's kind of as English as pie and mash?
I mean, well, I'll come to the relationship of cocaine, particularly with English culture, in a little bit. But I might take a second just to dispute the framing of British, well, maybe not indigenous relationship towards psychoactive substance, but definitely historical relationship to psychoactive substances, because we often assume that this is a kind of imposition of the 1960s, but you go back to the 18th century and you look at all of the canonical writers of English literature, whether we might think about, Samuel Coleridge or Thomas de Quincey, who obviously writes a book on opium use, The Confessions of an Opium Eater, we can see how the idea of a particular kind of almost romantic relationship with different forms of substance use and different forms of consciousness has been an element of English and British artistic culture, from the 18th century romantics all the way to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the work of Victoria Beveridge on the 18th century romantic sensibilities, and opium is a great example of this. And in terms of the
You know the story about Coleridge, right? Someone came knocking on his door looking for Wordsworth.
Yeah.
So invites them in. They get absolutely just riggedy wrecked together, and then just sends him back out. And no one sees this guy again because he sent him out in the Lake District during a storm.
Yeah.
And so he sort of comes to and he's like, oh fuck, what have I done?
That's hilarious. Wow. I mean, this is where, a lot of our canonical writers we all get taught about, on our curriculum. This was their relationship with these substances, and then also the commercial relationship that Britain had with these substances as well. I mean, we forget that Britain waged a war on the Qing dynasty of China, reshaping the entire global map for the right to sell opium. You read, people like John Stuart Mill, who's still the canonical English thinker of liberalism in the 19th century, and the idea of prohibition is for him the example of a backwards and uncivilized culture. That the idea that you would interrupt the free trade of different substances shows, for John Stuart Mill, the inability for China to be able to integrate itself within the global capitalist relationship. And so there's been a much longer history of Britain and drugs than I think often the rhetoric allows for. But in the kind of 20th century, you do get this kind of re-emergence of a particular maybe hedonistic relationship with substances, of which cocaine is probably the example par excellence. And, we see whether it's, Shaun Ryder and the Happy Mondays or, Oasis, we see this kind of idea of a particularly, like I said, a particularly kind of hedonistic, and people might say even a self-destructive relationship with substance use that is reflected by the relationship with cocaine. I think that what is really important with this question around regulation, and this is what I kind of learned about the initiative to try and legalize coca use, including cocaine in Colombia, was that a lot of the people who were advancing this policy didn't have a kind of celebratory relationship with cocaine. They weren't like cocaine for all, like this is what we want. They, like I say, these are sober politicians. The actual law was being designed by people who'd previously been working in fiscal policy, before they were talking about pensions, now they're talking about regulating cocaine, but they are not celebrating the use of this substance, even though it has a different cultural relationship in places like Colombia, but they see the idea of reform as mitigating and reducing the harms that can be associated with risky use. And I think that that's what we want to think about in places like the United Kingdom, because what we need to recognize, I think really important when we think about the United Kingdom, is that the negative consequences from both the use of drugs and the prohibition of drugs has only been visited on particular populations. And so those, working class or racial minority populations that you talked about who get associated with drugs in the type of tabloid media, they will be the ones who might fall into dependency issues. They will be the ones who will be stopped and searched. They'll be the ones who, if found with substances on them, will be criminalized, will be given a criminal record that will damage the rest of their life. But some of the people who are advocating for more punitive policies, people like Michael Gove, are on record talking about their use of cocaine. There was, I think the Tory leadership debate which Michael Gove participated in, the one which eventually led to Boris Johnson being elected, every single candidate by the time it got to the final five was on record for talking about their use of drugs. Gove with his cocaine,
Rory Stewart
talking about, opium smoking up in Afghanistan. Jeremy Hunt talking about cannabis.
He really revived that like Coleridge tradition of everyone else is like, oh, a bit of weed, a bit of cocaine. And he's like, opium in the Afghan mountains.
Exactly, and so there has always...
Swathed in paisley.
There has always been a different mechanism for policing drug use in the boarding schools of Britain, the elite universities of Britain, Parliament itself. I'd always almost thought that if there is any kind of initiative, there was the Tory initiative to like, if you're found in possession of drugs, you should lose your driving license. I always thought that like, implement that in Parliament for 5 years, have an independent authority, drug test everyone who comes into Parliament. If for 5 years you can maintain that, then you can talk about rolling that out on the public population. And so moving away from the idea that prohibition manages to minimize those harms is something I really try to do with this book, and look at what are the drivers behind the reforms in places like Colombia, Uruguay, Canada, the USA, and how might they mitigate some of those harms as well as potentially create new issues for the future.
In that last leadership debate where you had Jeremy Hunt and you had Rory Stewart, Boris Johnson, and Gove, the person who I didn't believe when she said she did drugs was Andrea Leadsom. I was like, no, you haven't.
Just trying to jump on the wave.
You just, it would now look weirder for you to say that you never did, but I just don't believe you. I just don't believe you. For my final question, and I suppose you've been hinting at this and spelling it out in different ways throughout, but just to bring it all together, if drug legalization by itself isn't actually a blow to US imperial hegemony, capitalist extraction, racist policing, police being weaponized against working class communities the world over, what should be done to repair the damage wrought on communities across the world by the war on drugs, which so dominated the 20th century?
Well, I think that this is such a expansive kind of invitation, and I, allude to some suggestions at the end of the book, but by no means think that, I provide the comprehensive guidance on, what should be the specific packaging requirements for newly legalized drugs within a new economy, or what should be, all of the different intricate kind of licensing regimes that you might implement within a different specific jurisdiction. But I think starting with dismantling the architecture of criminalization and prohibition, which has devastated so many lives around the world for no foreseeable benefit. We have 20% of the world's population who are in prison because of drug offenses. 2.5 million people, according to the United Nations, for drug offenses. But yet we see use of drugs, death from drugs going up year on year. We see this architecture of criminalization devastate people's lives years after they might have been involved in the drug economy as either a consumer or a producer. And so you get a conviction, for drug trafficking when you're in your 20s, you're still dealing with that, deep into, middle age. And so what is the first step for me would be dismantling that architecture of criminalization. And you're even seeing institutions that used to be advocates for criminalization now starting to lend their voice towards that. The United Nations Office of Human Rights, for example, even though the UN is the main system that anchors the war on drugs, they've come on record talking about the system of drug prohibition has simply led to mass incarceration, devastation environmentally. We're talking about aerial fumigation policies that devastate agricultural lands in places like Colombia, places like Ecuador. And so, what have been the consequences of that? I don't think there's been in any way an argument that could be made that the century-long experiment of drug prohibition has produced the results that it promised in the first place. And so I would say that is the kind of the first step. And then the next step would be the careful and slow process of actually thinking about how might you design these different regulations in order to affect different outcomes. I think one of the things that's interesting about the way that cannabis legalization, for example, has been rolled out across the United States is because it's happened state by state, you've actually seen different states implement different concerns in order to try and affect a different outcome. And so in some states, as you mentioned, there has been no implementation of any what you might call reparative justice initiatives. There's been no expungement of sentences. There's been no commuting of current prison sentences. You have states, look at places like Nevada and Alaska, that have legal cannabis dispensaries and still have people serving out their cannabis trafficking sentences, just down the road. And that is very different from the states that have implemented what is commonly referred to as social equity policies. And so New York State might be an interesting example of this. They were initially going to legalize cannabis in 2019, and it was actually the legalization process was stalled not by the conservative or the Christian right, but actually by the social justice left, who said, well, the way the law is currently framed, this is just a massive transfer of wealth towards, big capital. And so they spent another couple of years trying to design all these different initiatives that would, in their opinion, mitigate some of the harms of legalization and also try and repair the substantial damage of a century of prohibition. And so some of those initiatives is like a commitment towards people who have either been in prison or had a family member in prison on drug trafficking to be able to access licenses in order to function those new dispensaries. We're talking about a commitment to spending 80% of the tax revenue that's accrued by New York State in specific neighborhoods that have been subject to over-policing in terms of the war on drugs. So we're going to generate a lot of potential wealth through this transition. I think that there needs to be time taken to try and design the regulatory framework that will, like I say, put forward community interests, public health, and minimize the potential damage that rampant capitalism can, if left to accelerate, can do if we simply allow this to be a new commodity growth industry. And I think that now is the opportunity to do that, because in a decade, in a generation or so, we might find that the rules around this industry are crystallized or embedded, and it's going to be much more difficult to try and reform them at that point.
Kojo Koram, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.